An important concept to understand when building web pages is the box model. Now you're probably already familiar with the box model, but just in case you're not, let me review quickly. When you create any element inside of an HTML document, it exists inside of a box. This is what's referred to as the box element. So all elements, regardless of whether you see a defining edge or a border, are contained inside of a box. This H1 lives inside of a box. My paragraph lives inside of a box. These three strips are divs, and I've assigned some CSS so that they look like they reside inside of a box a little bit more. But that is all just CSS styling. Everything, regardless of whether it has these borders or not, lives inside of the box, hence the name the box model. If you've been working with web pages, you know that when you add borders and padding and width and height, that's going to affect the size of the box. Now, the way in which those things get added onto the box has traditionally been a situation where you need to calculate the math in order to make sure that everything fits. So let me explain in an actual HTML file. This particular file is a pretty basic page. The HTML is simply an article tag that contains a paragraph and then 3 divs. The first thing to note is that the overall width on my body tag is 500 pixels. This is creating this width right here. So the width that we see within the gray area is 500 pixels. That's the rule that I have on the body tag. Then I have a padding of 20 pixels on my article tag. That is simply just creating some space between the edge of the article and the elements that are contained within the article. So that forces these items right here to have a little bit of spacing. If I actually open up the developer tools and I hover over the article, you can see the blue area is the content area of the article. The area that's highlighted in green is actually the padding. So if I was to go to my article and if I was just to temporarily change my padding to 0, you can see that now the edge of the elements goes right to the edge of the box, and if I hover over, we don't see any more of that green. That's going to be a result of no padding. I do want the padding though, because I don't like things to bunch up to the edge. So knowing that little bit of math, that this overall width is 500 pixels and we're using padding of 20 pixels all the way around, we can determine that we have usable space inside of the article tag of 460 pixels. I'm getting that number because I'm subtracting 40 pixels, 20 on the left, 20 on the right from 500. So that gives me an overall width of 460 pixels. So what we're going to do is we're going to define some different width properties on the first 2 boxes to begin with. I'm going to go into my HTML and I'm going to use the selector of div nth of type, and I'll specify that the first div is going to have a width of 100% and my second div is going to have a width of 460 pixels. We've already discussed how we actually have 460 pixels worth of space available inside of our article tag. Remember, we're subtracting 40 pixels from 500, which gives us 460. If I refresh my page right now, you're going to see that these 2 divs have actually gotten just a little bit bigger. If we look at each of these divs, you can see that this one is getting a width of 100%. The second one is now getting a width of 460. Let's go back to the first one and let's look at our computed styles. If I go into my computed styles, you can see that 460 pixels is the overall 100% width, but it's actually a little bit wider than this last div, and that's because it's adding an additional 4 pixels. So the overall width is actually more than 460 pixels. 100% is taking up 100% of the space available, which in this case is 460, but the border is adding an extra 4 pixels, 2 pixels on the right and 2 pixels on the left, to the overall width, giving us an overall width of 464. If I click on the second div, again, it's going to show that the overall width is specified at 460, but then I have an extra 2 pixels on the right and on the left. And you can see if I hover over this div, that little tooltip that's popping up right below the div is indicating that it's 464 pixels. The same thing that's going to happen if I put it over the first div. Now the third div we haven't defined, so it is just going to be 460 pixels. Let's make a rule for the third div. I'll go back into my HTML, and what we're going to do on the third div is we're going to specify that the width is 460 pixels, but I'm also going to specify that there be a padding of 20 pixels. If I save now and we refresh in the browser, you're going to see that this bottom div now has spacing on the inside of the box. It's also spilling out of the space that is available, and that's because we're getting a width of 460 pixels plus 20 pixels from the right, 20 pixels from the left. That gives us an extra 40, plus 2 pixels on the right for the border and 2 pixels on the left for the border, which gives us an extra 4. So the actual width here is 504 pixels. This can be a little bit of a problem when you're trying to calculate how the page elements line up side by side, because you're constantly going to have to readjust how things work. So let me show you what I mean by this. What we're going to do is we're going to create an additional article on our page, and we're going to add 3 more divs. So this is just going to replicate what the first article looks like for the most part. I'm going to make an article tag. I'm going to give it a class name of floated elements just so I can target this one uniquely. I have a paragraph here, and then I have the 3 divs that appear inside. Currently, if we save the page and we look at this in the browser, you're going to see that here are these new div tags. They are taking on the same width properties as the above 3 because I used nth of type. It's the first div of the article. What we'll do is we're going to make a style in our CSS that's going to overwrite those existing rules. So let me make a comment that just says floated divs. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new rule. This rule is going to be for dot floated elements space div. So this will target the divs that are children of the floated elements. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to float these to the left so that they appear side by side. We know that we have 460 pixels. I should be able to use a width of 150 pixels because 150 times 3 is 450. That should work. So let's add a width of 150 pixels. I'm going to set the padding to 0 here so that they don't inherit any of the other rules padding, and I'm going to save my page. If we go back and refresh in the browser, you're going to see that the first 2 boxes do appear side by side, but the third one does not, and that's because my math doesn't quite work out. If we add 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2, so 2 times 6 is 12, it actually is giving me an overall width of 450, that's the width of these 3 boxes, plus 12 is actually 462. So I would have to make the overall width a little bit less. If I change the overall width here to 149, that should allow these 3 boxes to appear side by side. And then you can see that they do appear side by side. Well, oftentimes when you have objects appearing side by side, you're going to want to create some spacing in between them. We would usually accomplish that by adding some margin. So let me just add a little bit of margin on the right, and I'll just set that to 10 pixels. And now, of course, because they have margin on the right, it's going to force the last box to go down to the other side. So now I would have to recalculate what the overall width is. So I'm adding an extra 30 pixels. I should subtract that from the overall width. That's going to bring this down to 119. And if I save now and we go back into the browser, you can see that now they appear side by side. Now it is very common that I would want padding because I usually don't want the content inside to crash into the edge. So let's go back and add a little bit of padding. So if I add padding of 20 pixels and I save my page and we go look in the browser, once again, we are going to have spacing in between these, but you can see that now the layout is thrown off. So now I would need to recalculate the width again. Well, as you can imagine, this is very frustrating because you're going to constantly have to change things, especially if your layout changes. You're going to constantly have to be updating things and making changes. And this is true whether you're using pixels for the width or whether you're using percent. I might just say, I don't want to use pixels, I just want to deal with percent. So in order for 3 boxes to appear side by side, I should be able to use 33% as a safe overall width to have these items appear side by side. But you can see when I go into the browser and I refresh, they don't all appear side by side. And the reason is because now we have padding and now we have border, which is getting added to the overall outside width of these items. If we look in the computed styles, you can see that they're roughly, and this is a weird value now, but 152 pixels wide plus 40 pixels plus 4 pixels. So if I hover over these, you can see that they're 196 pixels wide each. So clearly that's not going to allow them to appear side by side. This is troubling when you're trying to create flexible layouts, when you're working with responsive layouts. It just starts to muck up the whole thing. Luckily though, there is a CSS3 property called box sizing. And what box sizing allows us to do is it allows us to kind of flip the box model, and it allows us to add the padding and the border to the inside of the overall width. So with the current state of the CSS box model, the padding and the borders are added in addition to the width or on the outside of the overall width of the content area. When we use the box sizing property, that gets added on to the inside of the box area. Granted, this information always appears within the box, but it's how the math calculates. So let me just add this property so that you can see how it works. I'm going to declare box sizing and I'm going to set it to border dash box. If I save this and we go look in the browser, you're now going to see that my items are going to be a little bit smaller, and if I hover over, you can see that now they have 152 for the overall width. So with the current styles that we have, 33%, the margin is still getting added on to the right. If I get rid of the margin, you can see that now these appear side by side. Granted, I probably do want some margin, so I would have to go ahead and accommodate for that margin being part of here. If I set the overall width to 30%, you can now see that they appear side by side. If I deselect the box sizing here in the developer tools, you can see that they would no longer appear side by side. So when I add box sizing, the size of the box actually physically gets a little bit smaller. Now the size of my box is 138 pixels. That's because the padding and the border that is appearing around the box is being added to the overall width. This is true even with a fixed value. So if I went ahead and set the overall width of these to 140 pixels, you can now see that when I hover over, the actual width, the calculated width, is still 140 pixels. So even though it has padding of 20 pixels and it has a border of 2 pixels, that extra 44 pixels is not being added on or computed to the overall width of the box size. Using the box sizing property with the border box value is extremely helpful, especially when you're trying to work with layouts where you may want to change the values at some point, or you're trying to create some sort of flexible layout so that when the browser window is scaled, these items will still work together. I think that you'll find a lot of use for the box sizing property in your layouts, especially if you start to work a lot with flexible or responsive layouts. Once again, I would direct you to the Can I Use website so that you can check support for box sizing. Currently, box sizing is fairly well supported in most of the browsers. You can see though that even many of the modern browsers, I get the limey green color, which indicates partial support. The partial support refers to the fact that only content box, which is the default behavior of the box model, or border box, which is the one that we're using in this lesson, are fully supported. The padding box, which is a spec that is added later on, is not supported in any of the browsers except for Firefox. This really isn't an issue because the one that we're dealing with right now is border box. So this is a pretty safe one that you can use currently with pretty much all of the modern browsers support the border box property. And again, this just gives you a lot more flexibility in your layouts and how the box model is rendered.